All right, welcome back to House Education on April 25th, 2024. Turning our attention to S204, the literacy bill. We've got testimony from two guests on the bill before us. I think we'll just jump right in. Again, Chelsea, if you would reintroduce yourself since we're on a new Zoom, and Megan, when you jump in as well, that would be great. But proceed, and the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Myers. I'm the Associate Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. And I have the wonderful Superintendent Megan Roy, who can introduce her credentials.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Roy. I'm the superintendent from Washington Central and former chair of the Act 173 Advisory Committee. Nice to be here.
Megan, interject anytime you'd like. Thank you for inviting testimony on the important topic of reading instruction. Literacy is foundational to being a lifelong learner, and all Vermont leaders should treat it as such. I would be remiss if I did not comment on the timing of this bill and other proposed legislation. As you are well aware, school districts are under tremendous pressure. This bill as written would add another cost driver to the education system by requiring lengthy training for all educators. We will comment more on that later. In many ways, the frameworks for sound policy to improve literacy outcomes are already in place. Local comprehensive assessment systems are required by the education quality standards, including screeners and multiple measures across all content areas for various purposes and data that should be used to inform instructional and programmatic decisions. That quote, or that definition is from the Vermont Agency of Education. Act 173 of 2018 and multi-tiered systems of support guide first instruction and support for student struggle. The IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is a federal law that guides identifying students with disabilities, affording a free, appropriate public education, and includes parent guardians throughout the entire process. Act 173 was designed to provide robust implementation and professional development support to the field. While the policy frameworks are there, as with many initiatives, implementation is variable due to a number of contextual factors, including but not limited to educator turnover and shortages. In short, this bill contains complex and confusing elements within the context of a robust policy framework already in place in Vermont law and regulation. We thus have some recommendations on how to support and reinforce existing legislation with S204 that does not interfere with or confuse the field as they contend with the myriad of initiatives passed in the last decade. If the House Committee on Education is to proceed with this bill, we recommend that it focus on 5 primary components present in S204. Early screening, updates to existing policy to better align with current practice, professional learning, both the current workforce and teacher preparation programs, maintaining the Advisory Council on Literacy, and expanding early childhood literacy resources. The rest of the provisions in the bill are overly prescriptive and/or redundant with existing policy. So to start, early screening in sections 2 through 4 of S204. Research underscores the critical significance of early literacy screening and intervention in shaping children's educational trajectories. Studies consistently demonstrate that early identification of literacy challenges significantly improve outcomes. Early screening, as proposed by this bill, has a twofold purpose. 1, identifying struggling students, and 2, informing the system of the efficacy of their Tier 1 instruction. I'm going to let Megan, I'm going to pause here because Megan is in the field. Megan, do you have anything to add about early screening, the MTSS Tier 1 and Act 173 in this context?
Yeah, I would just echo and reinforce the systems that districts are in the process of implementing because of Act 173, and frankly, even prior to Act 173 with Vermont's educational support system rule, is about screening. And I think, this committee has heard me talk before about redundancy in legislation. If we are implementing high quality comprehensive assessment systems, which is a requirement under Act 173, we will be identifying early through not just screening, but a comprehensive assessment system to support students. One of the things that folks have heard me say before is screening by itself is an identifier. It does not help inform what you then do with that student instructionally. A comprehensive assessment system is what does both of those things. And so when we're focused on discrete assessments or discrete screeners or tools for specific areas that don't also fall into that comprehensive assessment system, we risk identifying kids and potentially applying a blanket intervention that's not really part of what they need to improve. So again, just kind of reinforcing Chelsea's point here, we have legislation, we have systems that schools are working on implementing. That's what's going to improve our ability to identify and then intervene with struggling readers.
Investing in universal instruction is imperative for supporting improvement in reading achievement. Early assessment tools can and should inform systems on how to improve Tier 1 instruction. What does investing in universal instruction look like? Ensuring that educators are equipped with the training and coaching support necessary to provide high-quality reading instruction for all students. The Education Quality Standards, Rule Series 2000, state that each supervisory union shall develop and each shall implement a local comprehensive assessment system, which Megan just talked about. Guidance from the Agency of Education explains components of this comprehensive assessment and defines universal screening to identify or predict students who may be at risk for poor learning outcomes. Universal screening assessments are typically brief, conducted with all students at a grade level, and followed by additional testing or short-term progress monitoring to corroborate students' risk status. And then there's a small chart in my written testimony that shows what universal screening does and does not do. And as Megan says, it's not a diagnosis tool. If the legislature would like to codify universal screening requirements in state statute while aligning with existing frameworks like the comprehensive assessment system, and reinforcing the work that school districts are already undertaking, it should consider the simplicity of legislation from Massachusetts, and I cite that example there, and the thoroughness of the accompanying guidance from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. If we were to adapt that provision to the Vermont state context, it might read something like this. On effective date, each public and approved independent school shall at least once per year assess each student's reading ability and progress in literacy skills from kindergarten through at least third grade using a valid developmentally appropriate screening instrument approved by the agency in collaboration with the Council on Literacy. If such screenings determine that a student is significantly below relevant benchmark as determined by the screener's guidelines for age typical development and specific literacy skills, the school shall determine which actions within the general education program will meet the student's needs, including differentiated or supplementary evidence-based reading instruction and ongoing monitoring of progress. Parents shall be notified about screening results as outlined in the school district's education support systems procedures. And then there's a reference to the statute for educational support systems. And again, that would be to align language with Act 173. Anything to add there, Megan?
No, not to add. I think the key here is this simplicity of language is emphasizing what is actually best practice in intervention, which is identify, find out what the student needs, teach to that, and then measure whether or not it works. Act 173's broader language around MTSS is just that. When we are overly prescriptive, we risk the pitfalls of what happened in really early RTI, which is we identify a bunch of kids, we provide one thing to them that is not actually what they need, and then they don't respond. So the language that's in existing legislation is actually more aligned with best practice because it allows a system to understand exactly what the student needs and then apply it. And so the Massachusetts language, while also being simpler, is more aligned with best practice.
Additional comments on section 2 through 4. Language addressing additional diagnostic assessment is thoroughly covered by state and federal law. And BSA is concerned about the validity of collecting such data in the aggregate since different screeners will be used. How will that data be used, and will this be in place of another data collection or another requirement placed on schools? In section 5 and 6, which is updates to existing policy to align with current practice, we support the updates to the existing statute. For professional learning, in terms of the current workforce and development in section 7, professional learning is a critical component of any comprehensive literacy improvement plan. In the research brief, Building Better Professional Learning, How to Strengthen Teacher Learning, the authors point out 6 core components to effective teacher learning programs. For the how of instructional delivery, research suggests the following professional learning formats can be particularly effective at producing changes in instructional effectiveness. Built-in time for teacher-to-teacher collaboration, one-to-one coaching, and follow-up meetings to address teachers' questions and fine-tune implementation. For the what, there is growing evidence that professional learning may be more productive when it focuses on building specific, subject-specific instructional practices rather than building content knowledge alone. So taking content knowledge and showing how to apply that in the classroom. Supporting teachers' instruction with concrete instructional materials, and explicitly attending to teachers' relationships with students. School districts themselves are best equipped to provide the professional learning by addressing district-wide identified needs and aligning with best practices in effective teacher learning programs. The current language in the bill does not afford flexibility for differentiation. For example, a reading specialist who has had years of training around how to teach literacy compared to a teacher in high school that's teaching statistics. For example, that we would imagine that the professional learning would look quite different for those 2 educators. The current language in the bill, the language places a significant burden on the Agency of Education to approve programs for all teachers in the state of Vermont if they're not taking the Agency of Education's program. If the dosage requirement is based on the modules developed under Act 28, which is approximately 45 hours, this would be a significant cost for school districts. And to go back to Chair Conlon's point, we would hope for a fiscal note on that provision of the bill if you move forward with that. If the bill is to include professional learning provisions, it might align with collective bargaining agreements. It must align with collective bargaining agreements, not be another added financial burden on school districts and account for varying degrees of experience and need across the system. The committee might consider language that as follows. Each school district and approved independent school shall provide professional learning to kindergarten through grade 3 educators on implementing a screening assessment, interpreting the results, and determining instructional practices for students, and communicating with families about the results in a supportive way on or before the effective date of the screening implementation provision. The instructional practices must be evidence-based and effective and shall address the foundational concepts of literacy proficiency, including phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. What I tried to do there with the recommendation is tie in other parts of the bill, but also align it if you do decide to put language about universal screening, that we're giving educators the tools that they need to not only implement the screeners in terms of giving out the screeners, but how do we use that data to inform our instructional practice? If we just say, you must use a universal screener without any coaching of educators on how best to use that data, I don't think that we'll find ourselves very much further in a couple of years. This language would strike a balance between requiring evidence-based professional learning, aligning with the early screening provisions of this bill, and allowing flexibility for the school district or independent school to determine how that learning is best aligned with their system's professional learning. And I'll turn to Megan to see if she has any other comment.
Very little to add, just reinforcing the reductionist language in the current bill, which implies that you can pull something off the shelf for teachers is wrong in the same way that you can't pull something off the shelf for students. In order to really address the instructional needs of a struggling reader, you need expertise. So you need a teacher's ability to look at the student in front of them, apply best practice, see what they're doing in response to your instruction, and then do something different. That is not something that you get by having a standardized training. And given the constraints of school systems, both on time and resources, if there's a language in a bill that points to a training, someone's just going to apply a training, and then you're not creating literacy expertise. This proposed language or revision creates expertise, which we desperately need in these grade levels. So we support the need to improve skills, but we need to be really careful about what we might create, thinking we're improving expertise.
Can I ask a question on that section and sort of the comparison of what was in the bill that came to us and what you're suggesting here? So this is instead of talking about all teachers, any grade, any subject area, you're focusing much more directly, your language would focus much more directly on K to 3.
That's correct.
Is that an accurate read? Okay, thanks.
I'll follow up and ask, I mean, wouldn't it be beneficial if all teachers had some training in literacy instruction?
I'm gonna say, yeah, go ahead, Megan.
I think we're probably say similar things. I think you need to be careful about your definition of all. Early literacy is our most critical juncture. There is a point at which kids are not learning to read, they're reading to learn. So if you're talking about all teachers and you're talking about that 10th grade statistics teacher, I would offer that that teacher should not be teaching literacy. There are other systems of support that need to be necessary for kids continuing to struggle. But all, if you're really talking all, is potentially a waste of resources. Now, there can be some debate around the cutoff of grade 3, but we're talking about early literacy instruction for people who primarily teach in the classroom, because first instruction is where you're going to have the most benefit to improve literacy scores. It's not in the intervention realm. If we do better with first instruction, you'll have fewer students who need intervention, and therefore you'll need fewer interventionists. So I don't know that all improves what we're trying to gain. And again, some debate around the grade 3. Although I think grade 3 is realistically where the first instruction needs are greatest for literacy.
I'll just also add that the online modules that the training I think was originated from my understanding, they're about 45 hours. And to kind of put that number in perspective, as a licensed educator, that it was originally tied to relicensure, would take up almost all the required hours for relicensure. I'm gonna make sure that Jeff Bannon checks me on that. But if you are a subject matter expert in high school and you're using all of those hours of relicensure on those literacy modules, what are you missing in terms of your specific subject and your grade level?
There's a bus.
The dosage is important, I think.
Yeah. 2 questions. Why not include pre-K instead of just K through 3? And when you say all educators, or do you also include special education service providers?
For the first question about pre-K, I am going to get to that in testimony in a little bit, if that's okay. And then with the second, I'll turn to Megan.
Yeah, I think there is a difference in what special educators need in support of literacy instruction than what classroom teachers need. And it isn't that is, again, why the idea that you can pull something off the shelf or a module, I guess we're a little past the pulling off of the shelf analogy, but one size really doesn't fit all. First instruction is a very different set of skills. Special education arguably should not be redundantly trying to teach first instruction. They should, however, have increased professional development in really targeted and intensive literacy intervention. So it would extend to them in that sense. But again, the premise here is it can't be a one size fits all mechanism.
I guess I have a follow-up question, which is that if it says that it's evidence-based, then how is it being too prescriptive?
Well, the original language of the bill is talking about a module, sort of defined for us. That's why this language, which is looking at creating a identified professional learning plan in the area of literacy, is a more appropriate use of that.
Thank you.
In section 8, it talks about teacher preparation programs. Educator preparation programs are an important lever in comprehensive literacy policy, and we support this provision of the bill. Advisory Council on Literacy, section 9, we support this provision of the bill. Expanding early childhood literacy resources, section 13. We support the work of the Department of Libraries in finding more ways to support early readers. In addition, early language and other literacy skill development are crucial to literacy achievement. Learning to read and write starts long before first grade and has long-lasting effects. Learning to read and write is an ongoing process from infancy. Contrary to popular belief, it does not suddenly begin in kindergarten or first grade. From the earliest years, everything that adults do to support children's language and literacy is critical, and that's from a NERA report. For this reason, comprehensive literacy policy should focus on these earlier years. For example, policy considerations could include looking at early learning standards related to language and literacy across the pre-K delivery system. Are they consistent with research in early language and literacy development? Are they consistently applied across settings? Include required developmental screening for all publicly funded pre-K programs, as is required in S204 for K through 3 students, and I would extend that to the professional learning provision as well. Providing training and support for early childhood educators in evidence-based early language and literacy skill development and screening. Considering elements of programs like Providence Talks that aim to close the word gap. As we conclude, equity must be at the forefront of this work. Data indicate that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, BIPOC students, English language learners, and students with disabilities are disproportionately not getting what they need from the system to succeed in learning to read and write at the benchmark set for all students. Equitable access to high quality instruction must be a top priority in supporting this work. This is particularly challenging given the workforce shortage of highly skilled professionals in some regions of the state. BSA actively participated in the Ethnic and Social Equity Standards Advisory Working Group, otherwise known as the Act 1 Working Group, for its duration. Reading instruction is interwoven into the principles of creating culturally responsive and inclusive environments for all students. The availability and use of texts that are culturally relevant and representative of historically underrepresented voices is critical to ensure that all students can connect their experience to the texts that they are reading. For these reasons, we ask that the General Assembly consider ways in which legislation can support the successful implementation of the EQS from Act 1. Additionally, any data collection and subsequent support for literacy that shows up in S204 should identify and address equity gaps while respecting student privacy. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it to Megan in case she has any other comments.
I don't have anything to add. Happy to entertain questions, but.
We had Bud Myers in here the other day, and he was very strongly advocating that the data that's collected be disaggregated or be much more detailed in different classifications. And it seems like you're saying the same thing here.
Yes, with the caveat that the data that is being suggested to be collected, if it's different screeners across the state, it's going to be very difficult to draw any statewide conclusions from, because it's just not apples to apples comparison. Do you agree with that?
I would also add in order to monitor whether or not we're seeing improvements in literacy, the state as a whole, which does not disseminate data regularly enough for school districts to respond. We already know that. But that benchmark data of where the students are is still important data. I would offer that screening data, in addition to not meaning much given what Chelsea just shared, that's not really what you want to measure. What you want to actively measure, and in fact, what Act 173 asks the agency to do, is you want to be measuring, is the school identifying kids, and are they responding, and are they providing intervention? Knowing how many kids are being flagged at the screening level may not be super meaningful data. Over time, what you want to see is whether or not we're improving the ability of kids to read. So I think I agree with disaggregation of data. That is something we don't do well, and sometimes we hide behind our grain size or our N size. But I'm not sure screening data is the type of data that's going to be helpful, because again, I wouldn't want the committee to take anything that we are saying as not supportive of the need to improve literacy in Vermont. We have the same desire to do so. We're trying to do it in a way that works. And some of what's in here is not going to help us move it forward.
I will just conclude with, I spent a lot of time talking to Megan about what could possibly help move the needle and the language in the current draft of the bill. And I really did try to incorporate as much as I could, with also keeping in mind how the current structure and the implementation of MTSS and Act 173 is already in progress in the field. So
So the Literacy Council came up with its series of recommendations, which I can't tell you because I don't have them memorized. How do those recommendations align with 173? And maybe they don't necessarily mesh perfectly or have one to do with the other.
Well, Act 173 is a structural bill, right? It is legislation that causes school districts to have the structures to implement the recommendations of the literacy task force. So that's where schools' time and energy needs to be spent, is on those systems and structures. Do you have a comprehensive assessment system? Do you have well-trained teachers? So there are two parts of something. I don't think the recommendations, and I too don't have them memorized, to be clear, but I don't think that they are at cross purposes. I think if we don't invest in the structures within schools, we're not going to be able to implement anything well. And we know, I mean, you've heard from me, you've heard from the advisory committee over the past number of years, we have work to do in implementation of the existing legislation, and we need to lean into that work. And it will have an impact on literacy outcomes for kids.
The questions, Sarita?
I guess, I have several concerns, and, when I was in 2019, you worked very hard with, I think, Chair Webb, to create that bill, that got the advisory council, that got the position using ESSER funds. But what my concern is, and my kind of desperate need to do something, is the gap between low-income students and students with disabilities and other students. And, the advisory council went back 7 years. So it wasn't, they knew about COVID. They weren't looking at that. They were looking, and they said it is critical that something be done to close this gap. I think we know it works. I mean, I've been looking at research now for 3 years as to what works. I mean, Mississippi, Texas, there are states that have implemented where it's explicit instruction in evidence-based reading methods, and they know what works. And so my concern is, how do we identify the schools and the teachers that may have missed that training? I certainly don't believe teachers don't want to be doing what's best for their students, but how do we target those teachers, those schools, and make it real, just say, you have to take this training. We have to see improvements in your achievement data with these students.
yeah, I'll say what I think I said in 2018 or whatever year it was, is like, if we mandate training that is not based on the best practices of adult learning, like things like coaching, and embed it into a very intricate system, I don't know that we'll be any further along. And then I think we'd be having the same conversation. And I've, with the support of Megan, written a couple of reports on the support needed to successfully implement Act 173. And we've talked about it at length in the Act 173 advisory group, of just what you were talking about, identifying the systems that really need the support and employing resources like coaching, which tend to be a little bit more costly in those systems directly.
I was reading about professional development, and So it talked about the study of theory, demonstration, practice, peer coaching, and study of theory, no transfer, demonstration, very little transfer, practice, 5% transfer, and peer coaching is 95% transfer skills. So, I mean, you certainly have my support, for coaching as one of the most important to make sure the professional development is implemented with fidelity. So, I'm feeling like I don't want to wait any longer. I want this to happen. Because I don't know if it's like 17,000 third graders, I think in Vermont in 23, 24, are below proficiency.
Yeah, I think that's.
I would
why-
just, oh, so I'm sorry. I just wanted to reiterate, I don't think anything that you said, Representative Austin, we disagree with. The problem is, in 2018, had Act 173 been implemented with fidelity, with the support and deep professional learning, I would offer that we might be moving the needle. And so if we don't lean into that more structural, broader based look at what schools need to do and actually implement it, we're going to be in the same exact place, which is we've passed new legislation. We don't necessarily have an agency that can adequately support implementation, which means we won't implement it well and the needle won't move. So it isn't that it isn't a desire to kick the can down the road. I think it's investing in the right thing that we already have, or else we're just going to repeat the same lack of momentum. That's my perspective.
I'll also say, we prepared the testimony not to say don't do anything. We really did try to think of ways that could potentially fit within the system and encourage and support the best practices that you're alluding to.
So your testimony
Hold on,
prior.
we have only a minute left.
Okay, always going into Jeff Hannon's.
It's fine. Got it, Jeff.
It's a good conversation.
We need to.
Yeah, all right, I'm going to close this out. Thank you both very much, and I just want to say I appreciate that your efforts to work with the bill that's in front of us and provide some suggested changes. Very helpful. Thanks.
Thank you for the
Let's
conversation.
move real quick to have Jeff Bannon join us and provide his testimony. Welcome and jump right in, please.
Good morning, Jeff Bannon, Executive Director of Vermont NEA. Thank you for giving me some time to speak at S204. I've got written comments that I've given to Annie, so they're up, I believe, or you should have those available. So I'll try to skip through this. I think the conversation you just had with Chelsea and Megan was the right one to have. I mean, so a couple key points I'm going to add to my written testimony. I agree with that last comment about Act 173. I sat in this chair several times several years ago advocating for the repeal of 173, not because we didn't believe in it, but because of the purpose and intent behind 173 was 4 years of professional development for educators, teachers, to change their practice along the lines of what Megan really talked about. And that didn't happen. I was on the Act 173 Advisory Council. I remember working with Nicole Mace, Sue Sigalski's predecessor, desperately trying to get PD to be the priority for the AOE, and it was not. And then at some point, Dan French and Secretary Dan French said, look, the only way we're going to get people's practice to change is by changing the funding model. That was his theory of action. So in other words, change the funding and practice will change. That was not the design of Act 173. In fact, it was the exact opposite of it. So I think the conversation you're having just with Megan, person in Boston, that is the conversation. We think Act 173 can and should work. I had a spontaneous conversation this week with a Republican legislator who has a young child in the school system who talked about basically this being the first year of Act 173 implementation. The first year, this was passed in 2018 because of the delay and the pandemic, no fault, but the truth of the matter is we're just getting into it. Schools are just getting into it. And this Republican legislator, when I chatted, said, I'll say this quietly to you, but the teachers were grumpy about the change last year as a result of the reading literacy work on Act 173 and multi-tiered systems of support that Megan talked about. But this year it's working and they're getting better. and their child was doing much better at reading. So it is working. And I would submit to you, we need to let that play out and not add another convoluted or additional burden on schools at this moment, when in fact what we're seeing is progress already. And the advisory council, we support, talked about that in my testimony. We think that ought to be, that portion of the bill should be adhered to. They're doing good work. I don't know that you need to change the composition. They are doing very good work. If it ain't broke, don't fix it ought to be the motto sometimes. And they are working very well in that regard. The other thing, poverty gap that was discussed a few minutes ago. We've known this for years, decades. I remember testifying before a committee that, a summer committee that then Lieutenant Governor Doug Racine was chairing, and saying, if we're going to get real about these gaps, the achievement gaps, whether it be math or science or reading, we have got to address poverty in a real way. We've not done it. And so to blame the kids for that gap and is not fair. It's real. I understand that. We want to get better. We want all kids to read, but it is happening, there are shortcomings. When they're arriving at school, and what I'm hearing more and more from my members, and mostly from my board members, which is 22 teachers, 2 paraeducated bus drivers, but vast majority of teachers, some reading coaches, math teachers, science teachers. What I'm hearing is that the younger grades, kids are arriving at school not well prepared to learn at all in any shape or form. Well, why is that? And so I think the reality is they've got a lot of distractions at home. They're being raised by parents for the first time who themselves are addicted to technology and who are not reading as much to their kids as they were 30 years ago. And we ought to, that's not to blame the kids again, but that is the reality the schools are facing. They're having to fill those gaps in. And so I think that the literacy bill, the S204, needs to be adjusted to accommodate that. Principals, I met with the principals. Jay invited me to speak with the new principals the other day, and I spoke with them. One of the things they talked about was time. We talked about PD for teachers and staff. It is the most precious resource in a school is time. They don't have enough. I don't have it. I don't have it in my back pocket, and you don't either. And that's the challenge. So embedding, and I said this in my testimony, the standards board is the body that does professional development and sets credentialing for licensure and relicensure. I don't know that we need to change anything, just you could give direction to the standards board. It's made up of mostly teachers that want to improve the system, that want to improve how it is that teachers get relicensed. That's great. And I think that focusing on that area, that body that has expertise and doing so. Likewise, and that would, it's a companion part of it. Part of the bill that we agree with is the inclusion of the position at the AOE. I've sat in this chair and been critical of some shortcomings of the AOE over the years, but on this front, we gave them resources. They did good work with the advisory council. And I think we really need to maintain it. And I'm here to say I'm supporting the AOE in this regard, not my traditional shtick in many cases, but on this one, they got it and they've done it well. And that part of the bill we should support. I've got some other additions. One of them is probably in the findings. We need to be more positive. People ought not to be beating up on schools. This is not the fact that a child arrives at school unable or with shortcomings to learn is not the school's problem. It is their problem to address, but they didn't work in that. One of the things I talk about is pre-K that somebody mentioned earlier in Chelsea. Programs are getting public money ought to be held to these same standards, if you will, as to literacy prep and preparation. So I think that's another component of it. Section 2 is too wordy, too confusing, and we ought to scrap it. I'll just be honest there. I looked at Massachusetts. They have a very simple approach to this. They're number 1 in 4th grade and 8th grade. Maybe we can look at our neighbors just to the south and see how they do it. So I make some recommendations there as to how they approach it. And that's a significant change from the Senate bill, but I think it's a good, simple, less wordy, less convoluted, and less redundant. And as Megan and Chelsea talked about, as to 173. Think, did add some other changes in the bill that you can see, section 5. We think you ought to, the Agency of Education ought to hear from curriculum directors, reading coaches, reading specialists, classroom teachers as they do their reviews, and not just they seem to be categorized as others. And I don't think that was intentional. I don't think their omission was intentional, but I think that intentional that we hear from teachers and reading specialists and curriculum directors who are actually working with kids and trying to change the practice. I'll keep it short. There's a lot in this bill that we do agree with. Section 8, again, so section 8 does talk about ROPA, is the higher ed portion. But that portion of the bill does talk about the standards board. That's great, good, that's where it should be. We also agree with sections 10, 11, 12, and 13. I probably touched on some of that. Section 7 about PD for teachers ought to go to the standards board, please and thank you. And I'm standing between you and lunch and happy to answer any questions. My written testimony is there. I've skimmed through it quickly and get you to lunch, but happy to answer questions.
Great. Yes, Representative Buck.
So I just want to be clear, are you, when we talk about the screeners, you were speaking about should it be universal or not? That's one part of this. I definitely see where you're coming from Massachusetts language. I appreciate that. And then my third is just a comment, which is that I recognize that a lot of children are not showing up at school ready to learn. And a lot of times that is because they know their deficiency. Like one thing that I learned post that was really a problem for me, which was that my child was experiencing tons of defiant behavior.
I'm sorry.
Post finding out that she had reading challenges, and that the teacher should, after hearing from me as a parent that my child was experiencing lots of defiant behavior and hated school and whatnot, that should have been an indicator. But she didn't receive intervention until over a year and a half later. She was getting, they put her in, they told me that she couldn't go to a special educator because they're not actually trained in evidence-based practices. She needed reading intervention. So all of this gets really convoluted, and what we're trying to do is streamline it.
Yeah.
But I think a reason why a lot of kids don't show up ready to learn is because they don't want to learn the way that they're being taught. And how do we address that? And the screener would be helpful because she wasn't identified by the current process. And so if we did have something that's universal that takes that trigger and takes it multiple times a year, that's the other thing is they're like, oh yeah, she's in intervention. And then a year goes by, you don't hear anything. And we don't have any feedback. When our kid is K through 3, there is no feedback. There's no, nothing that comes home with that student to let us know where they are. And we only have one parent-teacher conference in October, and then we're out. So we don't have a system that helps the parents participate, and which I do really appreciate about this bill. So I'm sorry to be passionate. But to when your kid is at the end of 2nd grade and they can't read any more than a kindergartner, that's what parents are reflecting on, and that's the reason why there's a strong passion for this.
Understood, and I'm sorry that your child didn't get the supports they need. Part of what Act 173, I think, was just designed to do was help identify all children who were struggling, and some kids were on an IEP and some were not. And the design of Act 173 was to make sure that we caught all kids who were struggling in any way, whether they were on an IEP or not, and not letting them stumble along until they were so deficient that they suddenly became IEP students, where it's more expensive. The idea is to get the block grant change the behavior so that you caught kids earlier to avoid the more expensive students on an IEP. That was the design of 173. And again, I support what you're saying we want all kids to read and read well earlier rather than later. And that's important. But what Megan talked about is if we had I think she said the word fidelity, if we had with fidelity implemented 173, we might have caught more kids. And this is adding to and perhaps confusing what I think is the approach that's just getting going under Act 173 that would hopefully would have caught your child earlier. But the PD that the teacher didn't get may be the problem there. And I sincerely, I'm sorry that your child didn't get what you needed. Yes.
Yes, and to the poverty piece, what I frequently hear is that it's because the parent doesn't have the understanding that they can advocate for their kid. When I found out that I needed to be a stronger advocate and I raised my voice, I got feedback. What I'm not seeing is that any change happens without a voice being raised. And so the screener is the voice, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Or it's a part of it. And if it's not universal, then how do we look at apples to apples?
I think it makes sense. We are trying schools are doing that screening, but now under the guise of 173, maybe a more generic screening, but the intent is to catch kids who are having difficulties regardless.
Just a quick question about semantics. This talks about multiple universal screeners. So in other words, I don't think the bill talks about there being one screener, but that the term universal screener is more of a term to describe the screener than it is it being one being universally applied.
Yes.
Representative Austin, Representative Minier.
Yeah, so again, in the advisory report, Sold the Story, I don't know if you heard that podcast, just about, yeah. So again, it says the evidence is consistent and clear, explicit, systemic instruction on code-based and comprehension-based reading skills and needs-based support are the most effective literacy practices. And again, if you listen to the podcast, you read, it's where teachers say, I wasn't taught to teach reading this way, and they feel like they want to know. And it seems like the debate is over about.
That I disagree with. The debate has long gone on and continues. So for example, England in 2007 went to a singular approach to reading.
Yeah.
And now what they're finding is the results are no better than they were prior. No better. And so I cite in my testimony a report from the University of Bristol, a gentleman there, and he talked about scrapping the singular approach that they had and going to a more comprehensive approach. So that's a good read. I linked to it, and
Right.
And I will say that the academic research, as opposed to some other research, is less than clear. It's ever evolving. The science of how we learn, how we teach is evolving. So to sit there and say today is the day and we're going to call this the end of research, I think is not
Oh,
a
no.
faithful and
Yeah,
to
no.
the academic research. It is going on in this
Yes.
arena. It is ever evolving.
No, I agree. I mean, we should always be looking at updated research and changing practices accordingly. But, I think the evidence is clear that there are methods that the outcomes have a higher percentage of kids that reading for kids. And it's not one, I'm not talking about, there's a method that works, that needs to be embedded in
Sure.
reading instruction.
Ed Week did a really good deep dive on this. And there's a lot, this has gone on around the country, what we're discussing here. And what Ed Week said is no matter whether you change it in paper or not, it's whether you put resources towards it. Schools, states that did a singular approach, that did not put
Right.
resources towards it,
Right,
didn't see any gains.
right.
It's not just about words on the paper. It's actually, doing the PD necessary to
Yeah.
change the practice. It's doing all of that.
Totally.
But that's enormous amounts of research. And those states who have done it and done it well,
Yeah.
pump that money. And that's what we're talking about here, into that effort. We've already preloaded that under Act 173 is what I would suggest to you.
Mhm.
And Megan did and Chelsea did. And so I think we need to invest in that existing framework to push it along and see if we can't get to kids earlier who are struggling, and no matter what, whether it's math, reading, science, or whatever the case may be.
As long as it's evidence-based, as long as it's like based on good data,
Yeah, I would just say the suggested language changes that we have, continue to use the term evidence-based.
Yeah. But again, look at
Representative Minier.
Mississippi, Texas, Florida.
Mississippi, yeah, but so Mississippi held up. one of the data points from Mississippi is they had a huge retention rate in third grade.
Well, that was part of
That
the
was one of their
law.
policy practices,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And what, so, okay, so you keep kids back.
Well, I'm not suggesting.
No, I know, that has social costs,
Yeah.
emotional costs for those children to
Yeah.
be quote unquote failed
Yeah.
in third grade.
No, I agree with you.
And so those costs are not baked into the system. So perhaps we should look, at what Massachusetts is doing, is what I suggest. And also, just please note that Vermont is top 3 when it comes to 8th grade. And Mississippi is way down at the bottom again.
Mhm.
So I don't think we want to, hold rock, stock, and barrel where Mississippi went. In the 8th grade, we're way above them. And we're doing something right between them. And so I think the arrival, students coming to school, not ready to learn, is a bigger issue that we ought to somehow examine and see what are the other factors that are causing that.
Before we break for lunch, Representative Minner, you get the last question.
I hope it's a basic one. It's a basic definitional question, and I don't mean to be fatuous, but evidence-based, it gets used a lot. What does that mean?
Whatever, I think truthfully, so we just had a discussion here about, so I can cite a University of Bristol report, and there are other universities. Academics are looking at this, UVM has looked into this. So the evidence they're coming forward with is a singular approach that may not be the best. We want to make sure that teachers have a multitude of tools available to them to teach, meet kids where they are. One of the, I was trying to find it quickly, so a question about differentiated instruction. We take that out. That was 10 years ago in this building. Differentiated instruction was very popular. We want to make sure that we taught all kids as how they came in and how they learn. So it evolves evidence-based, and that's what I'm saying is today the evidence may look this way, but tomorrow it may look very different. And we need to be able to write statutes that can evolve with that ever-changing evidence.
But and so like peer-reviewed statistically significant knockback by industry, like
Yeah, I think that, that's a good working definition. I don't know that there's one specific definition that everybody would agree to. I think that would be the problem.
Yeah, all right, thanks.
It's a long contested probably discussion.
Yeah.
Jeff Fannin, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Folks, we are done